Witajcie przyjaciele. W Redmond jest 10 a.m.ish. Wieść czas na recenzję .NET API review. And Christoph will give me a 1 out of 10 for that.
Yeah, I was not sure whether you keep speaking in German already.
German's easy. Hallo Freunde, es ist 10 Uhr am Redmond, Washington. Und jetzt ist die Zeit für .NET API Review. Willkommen. German's easy. Polish is hard.
Oh, that was German? I thought it was Polish. No, it was great.
Y'all
I really like it.
Alrighty. We have a big long screen of things, and as you can tell by the list of tabs at the top, we're being, I was going to say ambitious, but really we're just being hopeful. So let's see what we get through. First up, add the ability to specify line endings when serializing JSON 84117.
Yeah, I guess I can speak to that. So this is following up on another feature that we shipped in .NET 9, which lets users customize the indentation character and the indentation size in JSON serializer options. This has been a bit of an old issue, but it came up again because we've had some partner teams as well need this. They need to have a way to customize the new line string being used when indentation is enabled. So this proposes effectively adding a new string property in both the serializer options and the writer options, where the default would be whatever is default for the current platform, but only /n or cards return /n would be permitted values in this case. For anything else, we'd be throwing an exception.
What's the use case? Just curious. This is to basically always be deterministic regardless of what platform you're on. Is that the
Correct? Yeah.
Do we enforce anything in there that it's only white space, for example, or is literally any string fair game?
So only new line or carriage return new line would be permitted, at least in the first iteration. For everything else, we'd throw.
We don't happen to have a new line enum floating around anywhere, do we?
No,
No.
no, no, no.
Okay. And nobody cares about legacy Mac carriage return only, right?
God, I hope not.
I think for this purpose, there are also some other new line characters that are recognized by some of the other APIs we have. I think we recognize maybe 6 different characters in parse. What is it? Enumerate lines, or replace line endings. But presumably we don't care about those other ones here.
Well, they're also not valid JSON.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
that's another point. In JSON, you can only have either of the two and nothing else.
I thought that JSON was kind of indeterminate on what new line endings you could use, and that's part of the problem. Is some people only use whack R, whack in. Some people only use whack in. Some people do allow the full Unicode range, and because there is no consistency and no formal spec around it, you can cause issues in like payload security issues by one serializer supporting a subset and a deserializer not supporting it, or vice versa.
So the JSON RFC is pretty clear that there's only a very finite set of white space that they allow, like between properties, list elements, stuff like that. You might be thinking of specs like JSON 5, which it's not a real RFC. It's just like someone's side project. But they try to allow things like any arbitrary Unicode line ending within the payload, and that's where you start getting things like security vulnerabilities.
I wasn't thinking of the RFC, but rather the ECMA spec for JSON, which is ECMA 404.
Oh yeah, the ECMA spec also does. It's actually more restrictive than what the RFC allows, I think. But even then, they don't allow Unicode new lines between things like list elements, which is what we care about. I think they might allow it within strings. But our serializer doesn't ever emit them, just out of an abundance of caution.
I assume from the comment we don't care about someone who wants like blank lines between everything, so they have /n/n.
Yeah, that's not in scope. We could bring that into scope, but I didn't.
I don't have a use case for it. I'm just trying to understand the parameters here.
So it's really a two-state thing that defaults to current platform.
Yep.
And then I don't know that it would match anything else on the type, but maybe string doesn't match anything else on the type. Should this be string or the JSON encoded text?
I think we can just create a normal form under wraps. In any case, in the struct, we wouldn't be storing it as a string in the first place. It would just be a 1 bit in an integer field, as we do with all other configurations in JSON writer options. And that's primarily because we want the default of that struct to, surface the correct value.
Didn't we have some policy we were trying to maintain or trying to mirror JSON serializer options with one of our attributes?
Sorry, I'm not sure I follow.
Didn't we have like a serialization attribute that you would put on a type and you could specify, or on your context, and you could specify a bunch of these options? And we were trying to maintain the same.
Yeah, that's a good point. We should add a similar property in the JSON source generation options. That proposal missed that bit. Yeah, thanks.
What if users don't want any new line? Can they just use a space here?
They
Not
could just
indented false, right?
disable indentation altogether.
I thought that was the general thing.
Disabling so disabling indentation also disables new lines?
So these are independent, and so new line would only be used in cases where right indented is also set to true.
The indentation kind of implies that you split it on lines, right?
Right, but I was thinking that if you need indentation, then you typically expect new lines, but you might not but just because you don't have indentation doesn't necessarily mean you want or don't want new lines.
Yeah, I feel like right indented is actually not compact, so it's compact or pretty
Yeah.
printed, and
Yeah.
so there are no new
Yeah.
lines in compact.
They are independent concerns, but I would consider new lines to be a component of right indented.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody wants new lines and not indentation. So that goes back to the someone woke up and shows violence.
All right, so
Yeah, I was more just thinking like if in the future, how do these play together? Because I expect that new line could I would expect that new line could theoretically expand to the full set of basically insignificant white space characters and reasonable like the at the maximum end of what we could do in the future, new line could just become is this a string that only contains tab space carriage return and new line, and as long as it's a string containing any of those characters or no characters, it's valid. But that's more a theoretical, how could we expand this in the future and how would that interplay with indented?
And sure, provided there's demand for that, we could take a look at it.
all right, so I assume public string new line is what should be added on JSON source generation options attribute.
Yeah.
And that just means that the generator is going to reject it for not being one of the two legal values.
No. So what basically happens in the source generator is that it generates code that populates the corresponding property in JSON serializer options. So you wouldn't get a warning at compile time, but you would be getting an exception at runtime from that generated code.
Fair enough. And then I assume the lack of specifying it will mean that it doesn't emit an assignment, so it stays environment.newline?
Yeah.
Or the fact that this has a variable default, is that going to complicate matters?
No, it shouldn't. Actually, I need to check whether we need to make this nullable in the attribute. Just because I'm not sure if we have precedent for other string properties. Yeah, so other reference types are declared nullable. So notably the converters property. So that should be nullable as well.
Okay. So not having an opinion is leave it alone, and then if you assign it, then...
Yeah, it's read by Roslyn in any case. It doesn't have any impact at runtime.
Yep. All right. Any last comments? Sold.
Thank you.
And today we only use environment newline, right?
I believe that was the case. And the justification. All right, Base64 URL 1658. Wow, it's such a tiny number.
Mia pinged me and said skip this one because he has a conflict until 10:30.
Okay. Metadata load context, get load context of assembly 98756.
Yes, I probably did a terrible job tagging people because I didn't know who owns this area.
I don't think you tagged anybody today.
Yeah, that's what I mean by a terrible job.
Okay. Alright, well, if anybody knows who to ping, it'll be up, quote unquote, next. Alright.
I mean, it seems pretty simple though. Like it's just a single property basically. So we have different load contexts, right? And all it does is just exposes the one you loaded it into. So it seems pretty straightforward.
All right, so you went back to the other
Yep.
one. Never mind.
Like unless somebody has an objection to it, I think it seems fine. It's also in line with other things we have. The only question I have is like, why is it a method, not a property? Is that expensive to compute?
Well, because then it would need to be a property on assembly instead of a...
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, never mind. Yeah, you need to. It's not on the context, it's on the assembly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should it be called try get load context just to make it more explicit that it can fail?
Well, it's not so much that it failed, it's just this assembly wasn't loaded with that context, right? So, I mean, now it seems
that there
reasonable.
is no load context. But yeah, I always find it odd when an API called get returns null for I couldn't retrieve it. I know we've got a few places in Reflection and we've got a few other places throughout the BCL that do this, but it's the type of thing where just using bool and try or naming it try and returning the nullable makes it that much more explicit that hey, this might not always succeed.
One downside to that though is depending on the pattern where people use this, like they might use question mark dot as part of a chain syntax to like go from the assembly to the load context to something else. Inserting a try API would break that if that's a common use case. And I don't know if that is a common use case here.
Yeah, and we have gets that return null all the time.
I mean, to me, try implies it would throw, right? I think this is not a place where it would throw. It's
Right.
just it communicates the absence of a piece of information that is kind of intrinsic.
Yeah, it's not that it couldn't find it, it's that it wasn't loaded with a load context.
Yeah.
Well, it's always loaded with the load context because you always have the default load context. So there's always a load context. It's just that the assembly might not have been. It might not actually be a loaded thing. So therefore might not be in a context. It could have been loaded as like reflection only.
Exactly. So it might be a metadata load context, right? In which case, sorry, the runtime load context, right? I guess.
Yeah, what I would probably say is if the question is sometimes nonsensical to ask, then a try API makes more sense. And it sounds like we're kind of debating, is this question always sensible to ask of an assembly? Or does it sometimes have no meaning at all?
Well, I think it doesn't, right? So, like, I think that's the... But you also don't ask the question on the assembly, right? You ask it on the other thing, right? Which you're scoping it to people that only care about metadata load context already.
True.
I think if you expose it as a property on assembly, I think it might be reasonable to say, hey, make this a throwaway method maybe, but I don't know, in this case it seems fine to say null is a valid answer. I mean, with multiple reference types, you know that it's null, right? Presumably most people are opting into this now. Like in general, given how the language works, I actually prefer nullable over all the try patterns. Even without var, it's still annoying.
Right, but so one of the things that I was noting though is that we also have places where we have try APIs that don't do bool out, but instead do return nullable.
Like what?
And just I'd have to go looking. We've got at least a couple of them. And the try pattern just notes this might not return an answer. It might be null, it might be default, it might be nonsensical. And the prefix of try makes it inherently more clear that this might return what is effectively false. I did not succeed. In this case, that happens to be the sentinel null.
I mean, it's a bit philosophical. I think to me, null generally implies the absence of a value, right? Which I think the problem that people have is that sometimes they don't expect the value to be absent, right? They always expect an answer. Like a common example would be path.getDirectoryName or something, right? Where it always succeeds except for the root. So that kind of is one of those areas where it might be surprising. But I think the problem in the past was that it's hard to discover that something returns null. You only find out when the thing fails at runtime, right? But I think, I don't know, like try to me, it still is more like a realm of exceptions. It's not really for communicating this might return null.
Well, the whole point of try is to not throw exception. So if you have try, it's very clear that no exception can happen.
That's 100% false. Try removes the primary exception.
Yeah, it removes one error case basically. But I think the point is that I think you're saying is like you communicate in the method pattern that there's another case you need to handle, right? Which the other one doesn't. And I think the problem that I have with that is that while that's true, it does seem a bit overly aggressive for things where null is a perfectly reasonable response.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fine as is. I agree with everything Emo said. And we've gone quiet. So,
which kind of implies either people don't care or
yeah.
they agree.
Yeah, the this is the first static on the metadata load context type, but I can't think of a better place for it, so it's fine. Alright, replace T from as a struct constraint on unsafe bit cast with a dynamic check.
Yeah, so this is just another case where we added the constraint first because the constraint was the most correct thing to do, and because of the way generics work, people find it incredibly annoying that the constraint exists and prevents them from calling the API from a less constrained context. So the proposal is to remove specifically T from, since you're typically casting to a T2 where you know what T2 is. However, there's a proposal just to remove both constraints because when you bitcast from, for example, an arbitrary T to an int, you often need to bit cast back the other direction, in which case you then hit the issue of, int now, but not T2. And so I had thought I had updated this, but the actual proposal is remove both constraints, and they will be handled by the runtime as well, instead, where we will still enforce that they both be struct dynamically via runtime check. It is not proposed that we start allowing it to behave like as if both types are reference types, or to allow value type to reference type or anything like that. It will still be the exact behavior it has today, just with both constraints removed.
And constraints aren't part of the signature, so removing a constraint is not a breaking change.
That's correct.
Right, it's only adding constraints that's breaking.
It can only break the implementation.
And it can theoretically break reflection if you're doing things like trying to query methods and filter based on constraints. Yeah.
Can be renamed generic parameters? They really can't be referenced on the other side, right?
I don't think renaming generic parameters is breaking today.
Because I don't think you can say like T from : they're only positional.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
Perhaps
so.
in all languages.
Yeah, sure, but
No, like
were you thinking of calling? Yeah.
It's I don't know if
Were you thinking
COBOL.NET does generics by name, in which case it would be breaking.
Were you thinking of just calling them like T from struct and T2 struct?
yeah, something like that. Because I mean, the primary value of constraints is, I guess, more documentation than anything, really. Like as you said, you still can't do the thing. It's just that it's enforced at runtime. So
we already have conditions that we check that don't show up anywhere. So I mean, there are other checks already in this method that are being done dynamically.
I see.
Plus, I to Tanner's point, like right now we're not proposing this change behavior at all, but I could imagine in the future we might want to allow it to be broader, since you can already use it to do bad stuff.
And then it's stuck with that name. Yeah. Fair enough.
Although
like that guy.
Notably, the reason that we don't have it doing things, one of the reasons we restricted it to struct and restricted it to same size is because it operates by value. There's actually a lot of subtle aliasing bugs you can introduce in the JIT when you get to concepts like promotion, or doing things like reference types to value types, or even reference types to reference types. So I don't think we're going to be looking at loosening that restriction, even if people asked for it in the near future, just because of the JIT work it would require.
So then, is the proposal to remove both, or just the first one?
It's to remove both, but
Yeah.
because, like I said, you often know what the initial target type is, like you're casting from an unknown T to an int after a type check, or that it's 16 bytes, so you want to treat it as a vector 128 of int or something.
Right.
But then you need the inverse cast back, in which T2 will now become the unconstrained generic type.
Right.
So you really need both removed, or we'd be back here in like a couple weeks going, hey.
Oh, I have the first half of my code working. That would be nice if the second half would work as well. No, that makes sense. I mean, we have done this in other places.
Yeah. Ideally, sometime in the near future, we get generic constraint bridging, and then we can stop removing constraints. But we don't have that yet today, so.
So you're using English words that I don't know what they mean. What is that thing you're talking about?
There's a proposal in the language to expose a feature that is being referred to as bridging of generic constraints. So it basically would allow you to do a dynamic check in your code. And so you might be able to say something like, if T is struct, or some better syntax. And then the language would say, hey, I know T is a struct, so now you can call a method where T is constrained to be a struct. It would allow you to do basically all of the features that are currently blocked based on having constraints like this today that we've slowly been removing over the past few years.
And we all editing back.
Yeah, well, we can't add them back.
But given that this is an unsafe API, like I don't think anybody would really be clamoring to add them back, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean it's an unsafe API, right? If it's enforced at runtime, it just means that it might not be as nice at design time, but it seems like that's already a toss-up because, well,
Yeah.
it's actually nicer when the constraint is missing.
And it says struct. Does it mean struct, or did it actually mean unmanaged?
It means struct. We do allow bit casting a struct that contains a reference type to another struct, even if it doesn't contain a reference type, just because it would have been too restricting otherwise.
Okay.
But that can cause aliasing bugs that you really don't want to deal with.
That's why I was.
It's kind of the same, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the same general principle of unions in C, where if you have a union, you're only allowed to access one field. Accessing two fields is undefined behavior because you can get into aliasing concerns that you might have an assumption that something's actually one type, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, then the constraint is really not that useful to begin with.
All right. Anything else? Boom.
Is Mia back on the call?
I am, yeah. Thank you.
And then let's.
Okay, back to Base64 URL 1658.
Okay, so essentially Base64 URL is just Base64, but a few of the characters in the alphabet are swapped out. And another subtle change is that it doesn't really require the padding at the end. From an API perspective, the current Base64 APIs are split between convert and the Base64 class we added later. Since we're adding new APIs, the idea was that we can just make a new type and put everything on that new type instead of preserving that split between convert. And as far as the actual APIs proposed, we can logically split them up in three ways. So the first part here, the encode to UTF-8, the code get max length is valid. This is essentially mirroring what we have on the Base64 class right now, and just replace Base64 with Base64 URL. The second part, the try encode and try decode, is a minimized set of APIs that give you all the functionality that's really there on convert right now. So that's essentially dealing with if your encoded thing is in UTF-16. And the rest are essentially just helper methods. We don't really have all of that for Base64. I don't feel strongly about this. You can implement all of them on top of the other APIs. They're just helper methods, so that, I don't know, if you have an encoding, we do the buffer rental encoding and so on efficiently for you, so you don't have to write that boilerplate.
So the second half isn't specific to URLs. It's just in the use case that you use it for. It would be nice if they would also exist, but they could also exist for the regular Base64 stuff. Is that what you're saying?
Essentially, yeah. One other minor difference between this and the Base64 APIs, we have the Base64 options enum or something like that, where you can specify adding delimiters after every few characters. We removed that from this proposal since with the uses of Base64 URL, I don't really see that being useful. And that should pretty much be it, I think.
Yeah, for the max length APIs, can you explain, are those relevant only for bytes, or would they be relevant for chars as well?
Well, if you're encoding arbitrary binary data, that's essentially mapping what we have with the Base64 class. With chars, I guess the answer would be the same on if you're only talking about how much space the result takes up, since it would all be ASCII essentially.
Right, okay.
Or maybe
So
I misunderstood the question.
So for get max encoded to UTF-8 length, the input is number of arbitrary bytes. The output is number of Base64 URL digits or characters, which won't differ based on whether it's byte or char, because they're all ASCII. And for get max decoded from UTF-8 length, I guess that's the same thing, it's just the inverse.
I believe so, yeah. There might be a few plus minus a few here compared to Base64, just keeping in mind the padding.
It doesn't change based on the fact that we're dealing with UTF-8 versus UTF-16. I guess I'm confused by the from UTF-8 and to UTF-8 part of those names.
I think they're just taken from what we had on Base64, right?
Yes, I'm trying to.
Which seems unfortunate, right? Because I think Base64 does not have any. Actually, it only has validation for chars, but it doesn't really have any APIs for char. All the APIs are UTF-8. It seems.
Well, that's because all the APIs for regular Base64 are on convert. Right. We have
Right.
Convert to Base64 chars and to Base64 string, and
It's still a bit weird that we had from UTF-8 and to UTF-8 in those names. If the answer would be the same. That seems unfortunate.
I mean, yeah, from UTF-8 here is really from number of encoded characters, and to UTF-8 is, I guess, if you have some bytes, how many characters this is gonna take to encode.
right. But the
But in the other
UTF-8 link,
APIs we have that target chars, we don't use the from UTF-8 to UTF-8 nomenclature, right?
On convert, I don't believe so.
I don't even know if convert has a maximum Base64 length. I think everybody's just supposed to know the 4/3 and 3/4.
Or we
I think
just
it's on,
always allocate it.
I mean, on encoding we have it, right? But that, I think even there, it's just, you call it the proper encoding, so your context is given.
Because yeah, if we're only writing ASCII characters, then a char length and a UTF-8 length are the same length. And if we're only assuming that the UTF-8 is incoming ASCII would give the highest byte output length, which would mean, yeah, the encode decode ratio is the same across the two character sets. Worst case, which is what the max is saying.
Christoph, do you mean to have your hand still up? Or...
Yeah, though I wanted to chat about a slightly different issue, so I'm not sure if you guys are done
I
with
see.
Oh,
this
yeah.
part of the discussion.
We never notice hands here. We just shout out.
I'll start doing
Since you have
this.
your hands up, then is that related to from to or unrelated as well? Levi, you're muted if you're starting to speak.
Oh, I thought you were.
So I'm asking whether your stuff is related to from you or to or also
Yeah,
unrelated.
I was actually going to suggest drop the from UTF-8 into UTF-8 infix and change the argument names to be more descriptive. So it would be get max decoded length int base64 length and get max encoded length int input length or something like that. Int byte length, whatever.
Do we even need max? Because as we said, you don't need the padding here. So there is a precise length that we can know.
Some people don't necessarily get that math correct. So it does help that we would just do the right math for them under the covers.
Oh, no. I'm saying we should do the right math. It's just, we don't need to say that it's the max length. We can say what's the length.
For decode,
yes.
if the Base64 URL implementation doesn't freak out at white space, then decode would be a maximum. It could produce an answer less than that. Encode would be exact. So it could be get encoded length and get max decoded length.
Wait, why is decode a maximum rather than exact?
Give it 4 million spaces followed by a B. Output's 1.
Do Base64 URL traditionally does not allow white space? I mean, how does
That's
this
why I
allow
said
white
depending
space?
on the implementation.
Yeah.
I know we allow it in our Base64. I don't know about Base64 URL.
Well, the
decode
Base64, yeah.
Yeah, the decode could also allow the trailing triple equals, which I think could change the answer by 1. No, you can't have triple equals. You'd have double equals.
I wouldn't necessarily rely on our existing Base64 implementation as a gold standard of what to do. We have the ability to make something a little better here if needed.
Right. If our,
like
if
our
the
existing
decode,
Base64, yeah.
if decode accepts AB equal as an input, even though Base64 URL omits the trailing padding, then if it sees that, the math would say that will produce a 3-byte output, but then when you actually look at it and remove the padding, it's a 2-byte output.
Right. But you can always know just by looking at the last few bytes, you can always know what the actual decoded length should be. But what I meant earlier is like convert.base64, for instance, allows invalid inputs and it tries to decode them and it guesses what you meant. Like, presumably we shouldn't be doing that here.
But like trimming padding and white space seems nice. And if the only downside is we have to say it's max decoded versus the exact length, that's not too bad, unless you think there's like a security issue there.
I don't think it's a security issue. I'm just looking at the scenarios. The scenarios are that, like Base64 URL, it tends to be in a path or a query string or something like that. Like it tends to be a token that's just there and not really decorated with anything.
Yeah. If it rejects, if white space would be rejected from the decode operation, then decode could be exact.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it would change an O1 operation to an O in if it has to go figure out how many spaces would be removed.
Right.
And worse, it would be a Base64, or sorry, UTF-8 ON operation. So if there's any non 1-byte space characters, then it has to ask everything.
Right, and the input is the integer, right, not the actual string. So
that's true. It's just from a length.
It can't know.
So it's the question of So this is why the padding couldn't be checked if it's optional padding.
So if we keep the max on both sides and we just drop the from into UTF-8, are we then happy?
I think you should change the argument names just to make a little clearer on what it means. But I would be happy, yeah.
Like the encode doesn't need a max. There are no bytes that would be skipped in the encoding operation. It will know exactly how many bytes it's going to write, or how many, whatever the Unicode word is for byte or for output. Code units. It knows how many code units it will write. The word came to me.
Symbols.
No. Well, wait. I don't know what a symbol is. It might be code units.
So if we do that, right? If we change the arguments, we remove the infixes, and then we change one max to just exact. How do we feel that this is different from what Base64 has? Are we
It's
okay with the
corrector.
descriptions? It's corrector. So is Base64 URL then corrector than Base64? Is that what we're ending
I
up
mean,
with?
I know that we have this desire to match existing stuff, but like if we think that the existing stuff is improperly implemented, then we may as well just take the time to fix it.
And this is niche, and there is a difference that at least for encoding, we know the exact value based on the length. Well, yeah. Did we know
We
the
do,
exact
yeah.
value before? Yeah.
I mean, we can't fix the other API, but we could hide the other APIs and add the same methods over there, right? So I mean, we could make the other one corrector as well if we felt like it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a general comment on the shape that I think that we should be symmetric across the UTF-16 and UTF-8 things. Like, we have operation status for UTF-8, but try for UTF-16, and it should either be the same. It should be the same for both, whatever we do. Both patterns for both, one pattern for both. But we should.
Yeah. So
they should be the same.
Yeah. This is the comment that I had, and or I wanted to say that I love the operation status APIs, but it would be nice if there was a helper that just gives me a byte array back, allocates. You know, I pass an input, it allocates the output and gives me the result back.
And that could just be an overload of encode to UTF-8, right? One that doesn't take a destination.
Right.
Well, which one? No, but it would not return operation status.
Yeah,
it
right. It would return a byte array.
Okay,
because it only takes the input buffer and nothing else.
Yeah, exactly.
That matches the pattern that we already use on things like system text encoding, where we have overloads of a method that have a different return type because they actually allocate. I think, Jeremy, some of the crypto APIs do this too, don't they?
Yeah.
They use the same method name in the overload. Yeah. So there's established pattern for it.
Yeah, the only time that you end up with a different name across the overload groups is when you move into the try world. Because in code to UTF-8, we could have the operation status one, we could have the int returning one that throws, we can have the try one that returns the bool and outs the thing, we can have the array returning one, like, we do all sorts of shape-changing overloads.
Speaking of overloads, like, remind me why we have a dedicated in-place overload rather than just saying encode to UTF-8 just handles overlapping buffers.
If you don't want your source to be overwritten and you want to keep it.
I think Levi meant why couldn't you just pass the same buffer to both source and destination?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I can say the answer of it's here because we put it on Base64. I don't know why we put it on Base64.
Like, I understand the scenario for doing it in place. I'm just wondering why we have a separate method for it.
I would have assumed it's for consistency between encode and decode, because one of them you can do. Won't one of them expand?
Yes.
So that would possibly fail for in place, right?
Well, that's why it's an operation status.
Oh, because
I think the argument was because you can't do it for both sides. We did
well,
it for
because encode in place just has the how much do I want to trim, but you could do encode in place by passing the slice to encode and then the same destination or the same buffer as destination. Right, because it's just
yeah.
But I guess I'm not clear how it would work with operation status. If you do it in place and it doesn't consume the whole input, but it overwrites some of that input that would have been necessary for the next operation, how do you recover?
Which the in-place one can't do anyway.
Well, the in-place one can see that it can't make progress in the next block. I guess so with the normal one.
Well, the in-place one has to be all or nothing.
Yeah.
Like you can't go partial because you're going to destroy whatever the remainder of the partial data was. Right?
So doesn't the in-place one then just give up immediately rather than overriding anything, or does it actually do partial?
Then why, if it gives up immediately, why does it return operation status?
I assume for consistency, but I don't actually know. I'm assuming it. My assumption, which could be wrong, is that it doesn't use all the values in operation status.
So it literally just returns success or fail. That's it.
That's my guess, but I'm looking at Jeremy to tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, it returns done or destination too small, and while the destination too small looks like it's structured in maybe a loop, it's actually a precondition check. So it's not an operation status API.
Oh, yeah, that's an API misdesign right there.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it looks all nesty. It's like that should have been outside the fixed.
Yeah.
So that's a precondition, and it's the only.
Okay.
It's the only time that I see false exit show up in the code here, because you can't click on labels in this guy.
Okay, so if this is what people are using and they're used to the weird semantics where it's not really an operation status even though it returns an operation status, then for consistency maybe we just keep using it.
I don't know, like I think if we want the in place, it should just switch to try, because that's all it's doing.
Yeah.
But I think maybe we just get rid of it.
But I have to say that
this is a good. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
In place is a hint. If I saw an API and it didn't say in place, I would not think that I can pass the same buffer. So we may say it's not an issue, we just pound the issue and you just have to know, but it would be super not transparent and discoverable that you can use in place buffer.
Yeah. That's fair. We should keep it because the semantics are different enough from the normal one. I do find it regrettable that it returns operation status. So like Jeremy said, this really is a try API, not an operation status API. But whatever.
All right, so I think, on a bunch of shaped things, I think the Base64 class predated a bunch of our span conventions, actually. So, I think this should be source, and we get to decide if this is destination or UTF-8 destination. We have UTF-8 in the method name, so we don't really need UTF-8 in the parameter name. We say that we need it somewhere. I don't think we need it in both. So this could just be source and destination. This could just be source and destination. This one, I guess, becomes buffer because we don't actually have guidelines of in-place parameter names.
Right. What about Christoph's request of having a byte array returning?
Yeah. I'm just.
It doesn't take.
I'm fixing the shape of what's on here and then adding other stuff.
Okay, sounds good.
When we do that, we'll want to figure out the naming for the related things at the bottom. So the bottom has encode to string, and decode to string. A byte array one would be a little bit different, but sort of similar, and you're encoding to something. And then there's that decode to byte array at the bottom, which seems much more overlapping.
Yeah. Because
I mean, you could have encode to chars and encode to string as overloads, right?
Yeah, no, I'm not objecting. I'm saying we just need to figure out what names we want to use.
yeah, I mean our char supremacy says we would just call that one encode. Right, like we'd.
I don't necessarily know if I would do that though, because even system.convert has convert to and from chars and string.
That's because it needed the two.
Fair.
It needed to vary by return type. And
yeah,
I mean, we can say encode is the thing, and then encode to string is the, which I feel like we have somewhere, because the same thing came up.
I see. So you would prioritize the char array, and then encode to string gets its own special suffix.
Yeah, I think that matches what we ended up doing on the crypto PIM encoding class.
Yeah.
Because we started with the like, oh, it's doing the writing to a destination buffer, so then like when we make the returning one, that obviously is an array, and then the answer is nobody really wants the array. So
having the word encode there all naked is weird to me, because it's like encode to UTF-8, encode to string, and encode to what? Like, it's not intuitive to me that would actually be chars. I don't know, maybe I'm digging too much into that.
Right. Well, because if we added it before we were doing anything ever with UTF-8, we would have just been like, oh, it's base64.encode.
Yeah.
Obviously.
But I mean, it exists, right? And we're working with an API that is very specifically meant for networking scenarios, which means like UTF-8 is kind of at the forefront of our minds while working on this.
Right. I'm just saying why it doesn't seem wrong to me, because this kind of slight impedance mismatch is inherent in the way that we upgraded the platform.
Sure, but again, like, this is greenfield. Like, we could do something clearer here.
Fair enough.
I don't feel that strongly on it. It just feels weird. If other people want to chime in, go for it.
Right, because like,
yeah,
that seems weird.
Yes.
I tend to agree with Levi that making it more explicit is goodness.
Okay, just
so encode to chars, I guess, is what I would prefer, but it's a weak preference. So it's honestly a very weak preference.
Okay, so are we happy with the way what we have looks so far?
I personally prefer to UTF-16, but I know I'm the odd one out there.
Like, that one's weird, because if it said encode to UTF-16, I'd expect it to still be writing to bytes. Because UTF-16 is the byte representation of the chars. The chars are the concept.
Christoph, do these APIs kind of meet your requirements that you had mentioned a few minutes ago?
The only thing that we need is the two methods that return operation status, and the new one that I suggested that just returns an array. Oh, I agree that we need the others too, for parity and for scenarios where people use, strings a lot. We don't. Let me.
Yeah, but look what's on the screen right now, though. I think this matches what you were looking for, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, pretend we also had the decode, but like, we're working a block concept at a time. So.
Yeah. Actually, I misspoke. We have two cases. We also sometimes need to get a string, because if we stick it into URI is all string based, not UTF-8 based. But we have both scenarios: to string and to 2-byte array.
What's the need
Okay.
for the 2 chars one? Like, what's the situation where you actually need an array rather than a string?
Array of chars or array of bytes?
Yeah, the char array. They encode the chars.
Oh, we probably don't need it. When I was talking
Yeah.
2-byte array, I meant 2-byte array.
Parity. Because we wouldn't call this encode to string that's writing to a span of char, because string should never be manifested as a non-read-only span of char.
Right. No, I'm just curious about line 17, like when I would choose to use it.
I mean, historically, well, I mean, for one, we had encode to base64 char array on convert. One reason that people would have done that in the past, though, would be to then go change the characters between classic base64 and base64 URL before turning it into a string.
The argument is that someone might want to change the alphabet here, and so they'd want to be able to. I guess. Okay, sure.
I mean, it's just the allocating returning version of the operation status one. Like,
yeah. All right, fine.
I mean, we can
I mean, implementation will almost certainly be 100% shared, except for like 3 lines between lines 17 and 18. So.
Right. This one gets to use string.create, and this one just gets to say new char and call the other one. So.
Right. You know what's going to happen is, like, we're a year from now, we're going to go to APIs of .NET, and that damn encode to chars API is going to like have 80% usage.
Yeah,
we're all going to be flabbergasted.
Yeah, you're probably right, and all the usage will be like new string, open pred, encode to chars.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, like we can easily cut it. I'm just showing symmetric shapes.
I'm just curious when it would be used. That's all. It doesn't feel like a big, very onerous to have extra stuff here.
Yep.
If it's useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think we ended up with the same conclusion on PIM encoding, which is we had the array returning one because that matched our try write, and then it was like, but nobody wants this; they want the string. So then we added write to string.
From a naming perspective, so we've got 2 UTF-8, which generates bytes.
Yep.
We've got 2 byte array, which generates bytes, but the difference between those, I guess, is whether it's the encoded or decoded. And then we have 2 chars and 2 byte array.
Yeah, I mean, well, we really haven't made it past this line yet, so
okay.
Don't take names that are below this line as gospel.
Got it.
So really, it's are we happy with to chars?
That's what we currently have. We currently use that vernacular on convert. Is that what you're saying? Oh.
Well, convert has encode to string, and it. All right, I'll look it up. API cat. It's 2 base64 string and 2 base64 char array. And then I think there's a try element OPQR. Yeah, try. Try to base64 chars.
Because it's not an array, the destination's a span.
Right. So in that sense, this matches that try method. And then this would be the returning overload of this method. Which again, we can cut if we think nobody wants it. But then now we can take we can talk about how much overload explosion we want by now also throwing this guy into the mix, who's clearly written in term of the operation status one. It's just changing the shape that somebody needs to deal with in their API. And if we like that one, then we get to put it up on the other one.
Is the idea that it's too onerous for people to use the operation status API?
I mean, if you're going to fail on... Well, actually, the encode doesn't need operation status. Right? It has too small and... I guess because we have this streaming mode where it has the is final block question.
Yeah.
That does have the I ran out of him. So as I ran out of input, you need to give me more.
Yeah, that's actually why we added need more input to operation status in the first place, specifically for Base64.
Yeah.
Or sorry, is final block. That was added specifically for Base64.
Right. Yeah, so if you're not doing is final block false, then you would never see this other input, so it's just a case label that you have to deal with. That,
okay.
I mean, like it's a color preference and aesthetics. It's, do we like it or not?
I guess it's also an accelerator for all or nothing.
Yeah.
Like if you know for a fact you're not going to succeed, like don't bother wasting cycles. Like let me resize. But
right.
Like the thing is, that's what you have get max or get encoded length for in the first place. Like,
well, get encoded length tells you whether the try would succeed.
Yeah.
Because this doesn't have is final block, it doesn't have to deal with input too small. And again, depending on how much overload explosion we want. This is also the exact same thing.
Yes, correct. You would get rid of that out int though, right? Because it returns the int.
Yep. Because it will consume everything and it will tell you how much it wrote. And so honestly, if you've called get max and you're not chunking, then like this is the one you want. It gets rid of a what do I do in the false case. These are all just variations on where do the error cases get handled. So operation status is you handle them all. Int is it throws if you didn't do your work up front. Try is you didn't know how long it might be. And this one is like just make it work. So
yeah. I don't like the fact that it feels like we're breaking into jail though, right? Like these are all, I don't know, like these are all useful. I could see people using all of them, but like now we're saying, okay, we have 4 overloads of encode. We're going to have 4 overloads of encode in place, maybe. Yeah. Well, probably only 2
okay.
of
Well,
those.
yeah, we'll get to in place when we're done with the first ones.
Yeah.
Like I think
did
that
we
these
just
are
turn...
all fine.
I agree. I'm sad that it seems like we've turned a relatively simple proposal into like a 24 method monstrosity.
Again, but this is all like implementation wise. There's only one method.
Fair.
This one is the only weird one. No, because encode knows exactly how much it's going to write.
Yeah. I shouldn't say monstrosity. Like it's going to be a straightforward implementation. It's just we took something relatively simple and maybe made it a lot of work for the future crew. A lot of maintenance for the future crew.
No, wait. This is Base64 length. Yeah, I mean, from a color aesthetics perspective, I think that we want all of them.
That's fair. And we could also go through and if we wanted to kind of, I guess we don't really need to add these to the other Base64 API because they already exist on Convert. And there are also options to keep in mind.
Yes, it has many of them. But
yeah.
All right. In place. So let's move this above the line because we're not talking about it.
Looking at the implementation for this one, it just feels like a food gun for whoever thinks about using it.
I mean, you could make it a try. That way it either succeeds entirely or it fails entirely, right? Then it would be less of a foot gun.
Right, and that's the way the implementation is currently written.
Right.
It says,
the foot gun, I think,
I can't, or okie dokie.
Yeah. I think the foot gun is really that the operation status pattern wants you to say, oh, destination too small, let me shuffle some things around and call again. And that might be a foot gun because that's not really the right pattern to use here. Actually, I guess it is the right pattern.
Okay, and then does this become data length, source length, input length?
Data length seems okay.
Okay, just data has appeared nowhere in this proposal so far.
And I don't think we need a throwing accelerator.
Now, if you want to do the in place, you figure out what you want to do when it's false.
Yeah.
So then, oh, you can't encode to chars in place because that's a mismatched data type.
Right.
So we don't need parity on that one. Okay, so now decode.
Does decode from UTF-8 in place ever fail?
If the data is invalid.
Okay. And that would, assuming we move to the try pattern, are we going to? Would that just be failed?
It's below the line. We're not there yet.
Okay. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
No, you're good.
All right, so I think decode from UTF-8, we want the same square. All right, so int writing, which gets rid of all of those. Allocating, which gets rid of that.
Right.
And then the try.
By the way, in the try encode to UTF-8 overloads, your third overload uses char instead of byte. It's line 19.
All right, so then these three will all throw for invalid input. The only one that can handle invalid input is the first one. Because This would be try write, which means it's only allowed to return false for destinations too small. This one's
Which will never happen.
Would that surprise people?
That's our try write answer, because what somebody will do if they call try write and it fails is they'll double the length of destination and try again. If the input's invalid and we return false, they're going to So they're throwing one way or the other, so we're throwing your data's invalid. If you want to handle invalid data, you call the complicated one.
And there's also an isValid helper if you really care. Okay.
Right.
No, that's fair.
Okay, so now we get decoding from chars. And I'll fix the types in a moment. And so, where do we want the string one on this? Nowhere? All of them?
Maybe we just don't have decode from string.
Sorry, I mean, we wouldn't need to say decode from string, but it's... Now we get the, like...
Oh, you want a string-specific overload?
Yeah. Or do we say this is too low level, you shouldn't care? Like, you should know that string is convertible to read-only span if you're calling this guy. I don't know. I'm asking the question.
I like the idea of just telling everyone to route through the span overloads. The only reason encode to string needs a special method is because it's a factory, but we don't have a factory here, so eh.
You could always add it later, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I guess a similar question with the current convert. There's a bunch of overloads for like array and array offset and so on. I deleted all those in favor of span. I don't know if anyone here cares for those.
That sounds good.
Yeah. Again, I think the original Base64 we wrote as we were writing span, and we're like, maybe no one's ever going to understand this thing.
Decode in place, yeah.
Void. If it's going to throw for invalid input.
I think it's int telling you how many semantic bytes are left in your buffer.
Oh, really? I mean, if it's going to return an int, could you just... I mean, it would be a weird change of pattern, but it could be bytes written and you'd remove the out. But, like...
Huh?
Well, I'm just saying, I mean, obviously you could calculate the bytes remaining based on bytes written. And I'm just like, you know, I'm sure there are other APIs that I'm not thinking about that have the bytes remaining.
So this goes back to if this API ignores white space, and I don't know if it will, then that's why we have the max decoded length. But you don't know, did this write 0 total bytes because it was all white space, or 1 byte, or so you need this answer. It can be the return value.
Right.
Because this looks weird.
I mean,
exactly.
Miha, can't we just ask, like, Miha, does this API allow white space?
I haven't really thought about it, but I don't know if you were looking into that before.
Can we just say no?
I mean, is there a RFC for Base64 URL, and does it allow white space?
Yeah, we could look at that. Another thing is, like, it doesn't matter for this API in particular, right? Because, like, it will always throw or, like, succeed, right? Like, it can only be smaller.
Right. This is invalid input or it worked, and you just need to know how many bytes are now usable in your buffer. If we don't and we'll never allow white space, then we get rid of the word max and decoded length, and we could tell you you should call that. But once it's void with an input, we could return that as an answer for you. I think
happens if
EAX
you
gets
pass
burned no matter
3?
what. So.
But what happens if you say get decoded length input equals 3?
Base64 URL doesn't require trailing padding, so that's always a semantic. It has an answer for that.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
I thought that multiples. I thought that answers that are, when divided by 4 modulo, result in a modulus of 3 are invalid for Base64, including Base64 URL.
The RFC 4648 section 5 notes, but if the data length is known implicitly, this can be avoided by skipping the padding. So padding skipping is allowed if the length is implicitly known.
I think you can't have a length that's winded is remainder 1. Because that would only
Maybe it
have
was remainder 1,
6 bytes of content. So it needs to be 2, 3, or 4. So it needs to be 0, 2, or 3 mod 4.
Okay, got it.
1, I think, would be invalid. Because Base64 ends in nothing equals or double equals. You can't end in triple equals.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, I did like a little bit of reading on like why Base64 had padding in the first place, and it seems like some scenario where you're like streaming it without framing. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so this input can be invalid because it's a non-valid character, and it can be invalid because it's the wrong length. But so it can throw, but the destination can't be too small because it's a shrinking. It's a shrinking thing. It's always going to be smaller, and I don't think we want void out, so I think it becomes this.
Yes. Correct.
Okay.
And then we tell people don't use encode to UTF-8 in place or decode from UTF-8 in place in streaming scenarios because it'll break.
Yeah. Like, I don't know what our opinion on this is going to be. Is it going to look for invalid characters before writing, or is it going to find out later in life, like, hey, that was a bad idea? So,
I mean, in general,
this
for
one's
APIs
just a precondition.
that have a destination.
But
yeah, well, for APIs that have a destination buffer, in general, if an error occurs during processing, the destination buffer should assume to be trashed.
Yeah.
In general. And we could document that here.
The operation status APIs support in place, right? You were saying, like, it's just not obvious that
they won't know they're in place.
But it's not going to like break. It's like not going to be like mem move versus mem copy or something.
I think if we want this one to work, somebody has to do work to do so, because they'll have to read backwards.
Yeah. The implementation would just throw an exception if the source and destination overlap. Many of our operation status APIs do that.
Okay, like, because I was going to argue if they did, like, how many people are really doing this in place?
Right.
Like, is that super common? We could just delete the API.
Christoph's doing it in place.
Is he? Okay, I missed that.
But the thing is, like, the in-place APIs can't be streamed. That's the problem, and that's a really subtle distinction between the in-place APIs and the normal APIs.
Can't be streamed?
Correct. If you call decode from UTF-8 in place, you need to make sure that the buffer is the entirety of the Base64 contents and not just a partial view of them. Like, it can't be like one packet from the network. It has to be the entire network stream that's already been concatenated together.
For what it's worth, it looks like the existing Base64 encode to UTF-8, they don't check overlapping, so if you use that with the same buffer, you'll get trash.
Oh, interesting. Bug. But anyway, yeah. And like Base64 URL isn't meant for streaming anyway, right? As we just established. That's why you don't need the padding.
Yeah.
Okay. So assuming we're happy with that, now we get to move down to the is valids.
This all seems fine to me. I would probably make UTF-8 a prefix instead of a postfix in the argument names, but just minor quibbles.
Is it really worth having the overloads that don't have the out parameter, since it's just going to defer to the one that has the out parameter? A user can just do out underscore, and it's like 3 characters basically.
Does it change register trashing?
Not if it's just going to defer anyways.
I mean, the caller wouldn't know
and I
that.
very much doubt we're going to implement it twice.
Right, but the caller, the method calling is valid. It's a question of like, does that make this guy responsible for register restoration versus the caller of is valid?
The
I just don't know how
registration is
outs
going
work.
to be the same regardless, especially with inlining.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's basically just a question of, does it need to be convenient for the user to not have to do out underscore?
Yeah, I mean,
I was also wondering, like, do we have the ability to optimize the algorithm if we're not calculating the total length? But like, the inputs are going to be small anyway, so who cares?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is aesthetically nicer, especially for the Boolean, because you'd be looking at like, you know, and you're like,
yeah,
wait, what's this out? Nothing. You'd be like, that's a weird thing in my if. So
true.
I think it's aesthetically pleasing if we, given the if it's valid, do a thing.
I definitely agree it's more aesthetically pleasing. I would think though that most of the time that if you're checking if it's valid, you probably want the length as well though. Because you're likely going to then be doing other things with it based on that length.
I mean,
I don't have a strong preference, just wanted to call it out.
A very common pattern for people to do is to say, if input is valid, then do something with input. So they would say, if is valid, query string sub foo, then decode from chars query string sub foo. And that way they don't need exception handling anywhere, and they don't need a try pattern anywhere.
Right.
Like, people do this.
This is, again, where we get to the interesting, the question of, does Base64 URL allow white space? Because if it doesn't allow white space, we don't need out decoded length, just call get the decoded length API. If we said the input's valid, then the only parameter to the length is the length of the input. This only makes sense if it has to actually count characters.
I would vote that this API should be opinionated and say no white space, no padding.
And then Base64 always allows white space. There isn't even an option to disallow white space, so we're just flipping for URL.
I think I don't know if we've fixed it yet, but originally it was convert to Base64 allows white space because it's supposed to, and system buffers text Base64 did not because they wanted it to be faster. And
we made that consistent in .NET 8, so they both allow it.
Thank you.
So can we just allow it, like, because people are going to ask for it?
For Base64 URL white space, really?
I mean, maybe not, but like,
because the original Base64 came from PEM.
It came from MIME encoding.
Yeah, and you were supposed to wrap it after 72 characters, so white space was built into that one.
Okay.
This one, I think, is you're not supposed to have white space because you're supposed to be in a URL. But people use it
And
in like JSON because like, oh, it's 2 bytes smaller because we got rid of the equals on the end.
But even there, using white space would be, yeah.
Well, and if we don't have padding, then nothing should be percent encoded, so nothing should need. It should always be an exact length.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Because if white space traditionally is new lines, and if you throw this in JSON, you're gonna have to escape a new line character. There's no way around it.
Right. So if the Base64 URL implementation says no white space, then we don't need the second overloader instead of don't need the first one.
Well, I mean, we're allowed to be opinionated in this API. It's just the
Sure.
the feature owner needs to put their foot down and say, like, this is the opinion we hold.
Why wouldn't you allow the padding inclusion, though? Isn't that going to make it so that many URLs that people split out of the, or so that much of the Base64 URL data they split out of the main URL, they would also have to have logic to remove the padding if it exists and decode the percent encoded version of it, since that's fairly common for the padding.
I've never seen in practice an implementation of Base64 URL that leaves the padding bytes.
I mean, the super naive one that calls convert to Base64 char array and just replaces the 2 characters that this like slash and whatever the other one.
I feel like I've seen that.
Yeah. I don't even think most people do that though. Like I think people literally just put stuff in the query string and call it a day.
Yeah,
I mean, people absolutely Base64 encode stuff and do the replace of the 2 characters.
Yeah, I've seen to Base64 string dot replace, and then maybe they call dot replace with double quote equal to the empty string to remove those trailing ones at the end. But
given that people are already doing that, doesn't that mean that that code is already using replace convert to Base64 string, and they would not use this API?
Well, people might decode it though.
Yeah,
right?
it's a question of if they're reading stuff written by those people. So
it is. So then you call decode, and then you say input string dot trim end open paren single quote equal single quote close paren.
Yeah, or
I mean, yeah, or you just don't make it necessary because the built-in implementation would do it.
Well, but it is complicating some of the things that we're trying to do with the API, though. That's the thing.
Right. I mean, so if we start off opinionated, we'll do that, and then if we make it flexible later, then we end up with that. So why don't we just approve all 4?
I mean, there is the argument that you should start out opinionated, and then like because we'll never be able to like be stricter later. We could relax it.
Well, opinions have a way of working into the API surface. Like we don't have get max decoded length if we're opinionated. We have get decoded length.
Right.
So like that's true. So you're saying it would be harder than later to relax it because then you would have to like deprecate the decoded length.
Get max also has the interesting. If it's max, then it can ignore the mod 1 answer and say that it subtracts it and floors it because like that's when encode operation status will run out. And if we get rid of the max, then should it throw on the mod 1 answers? But opinions become more interesting if we get rid of the word max there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, as far as shape, I see this being what we end up with in evolution, so why not just do it now?
Sure.
Alright, so now this is what's left of convert, and the question is, did we already cover it? So try encode to chars. I have a highlight saying it was up. Try decode from chars. Encode to string. Why does encode to string need an encoding?
Well, this is if you have both if you already have a string, for example, you want to encode, we don't want to assume an encoding. It's essentially, you could call encode to string encoding get bytes of chars. This is saving you some work and the allocation if you wrote it in a simple way.
Yeah, this is so you have an input string that represents the data that you want to encode. You turn that into bytes using the encoding, and then you Base64 URL encode those bytes.
Make people do that by hand. So basically,
Yeah.
you're saying like the cars really aren't like UTF-16, which like at that point, that's fine.
No, they are.
Oh, they are.
They are UTF-16. It's just Base64 is a byte to string conversion. And that means the input needs to be bytes,
Right.
so you need to go from chars to bytes somehow.
Yeah, so the default is UTF-8, and that's
Well,
like what everyone uses, right?
But who would have text and want it to be Base64ized? What's the scenario?
And
Generally,
Base64 is another encoding.
it's you have arbitrary text that might contain delimiters that aren't URL safe. So you just want to say, I want to make this text URL safe. So I'm just Base64 URL encoding the whole thing. I know.
Yes, but that means that we're then overloading all the encodes.
Well, this is really a convenience accelerator. Like I'm not necessarily sold on it as an idea because like we shouldn't hide the fact that Base64 is a binary to text conversion. Like it is, and nothing we say will ever undo that. This is kind of a way of saying, well, we're making it a text-to-text conversion kind of as a convenience for you. But ideally, if we did that, it would not be on this type.
Yeah, this would be every overload of encode, right? All of these would then get doubled to take a read-only span of char source with an encoding parameter as a formal parameter.
Right.
And I don't think that's warranted.
I mean,
Well,
you could not.
Yeah, it's a helper. You can write the efficient thing already with the APIs we have on top.
Yeah, I think if there's a more clear scenario later, I'd be easier convinced. But the fact that I don't think we have this anywhere else.
We never even put this on convert.to Base64 string.
Right.
And if the framework went 24 years without that, like this API probably can too.
Yeah.
So when you say you could do this already, like because it's convenience without losing any efficiency, would it be using like the span based like UTF-8 encoding APIs on like a stack alloc read only or span a byte or something?
I mean, that's one way to do it, yeah.
Well, producing the string as an output may be ugly because I think you might have to pre-count some things. But you can do this with an operation status thing because you can read this chunked with the encoding and then transform it chunked with encode to whatever.
Well, you just call encoded string still, right? Like that exists. You just need to get to read only span a byte.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, yeah, delete it. It seems like most people want to delete it for now. We can add it later.
And then that one we already have. This is the same thing, and that one got called decode from chars. So it's not decode 2-byte array.
But by the way, streaming that becomes extraordinarily complicated.
Right, which is why you don't stream Base64 URL. What?
Well, it's because the encoding does have a streaming API, but it's stateful, so you can't easily do that in an operation status returning API, which is stateless. They can't easily be represented back and forth as each other.
Encoding stateful?
If you want to do streaming conversion, it is stateful, yes. Because you have to call get encoder or get decoder, and that object is a stateful object.
Fair enough. All right. So that's what we got to by committee.
Encode
Do you
input
want to?
is-
Oh, sorry.
has a try pattern, and the decode is not.
Right. So in code, the output gets bigger. So if data length is more than 3/4 the size of buffer, then it will return false. Decode gets smaller.
Yeah. The important part here is that they both have a failure. Try methods have a failure case where if the input is invalid, it's going to throw an exception even though it was a try method. So
this
encode
one
will never have invalid inputs.
Yeah, this one has nothing that would throw.
Yeah.
This one will throw off invalid data. So we could make it try where it returns false if I wasn't actually Base64 data,
Gross.
but like that's the only try that would be returning false for invalid input instead of an invalid length on this class.
Exactly. I would be consistent with that, one way or the other.
Yeah. So this one can fail based off the ratio of these two things, and that's what the try is reporting, and this one only fails from an input, and it fails by throwing. Don't call it if it wasn't Base64 data.
Now, are we willing to stand strong in our beliefs and say that we are going to be strict on inputs for decoding, and therefore we can change get max decoded length to get decoded length? Because like if we're that strict, oh yeah, sorry, all I was gonna say is if we're that strict.
Yeah. Well, it's what should get this method. What should it return if you input 1?
Yeah. Max is fine.
Is it 0? Is it throw? Is it 1? Is it like? I guess those are the only 3 answers. 0, 1, and throw.
Then it would be 0 at that point. Because if we want to say like we reserve the right to allow padding, then the Base64 string could just be a single equal sign, and the decoded length is 0.
I mean,
like as was mentioned earlier.
Well, the thing that's 1 mod 4 is always invalid. But
right, but this is
so if you give
decoded length, yeah.
If you input 5, if it says the max output is 3, that's telling you when the operation status is going to tell you I have invalid or not enough input or whatever. Like right. I wrote 3 and then I stopped.
Yeah.
But which I mean I guess is the same. Yeah. So really the question is, do we ever think we're going to support padding and or whitespace? And if it's no, we get rid of max.
Honestly, the word max isn't hurting anyone there.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And while I could see not wanting to support whitespace ever, I would definitely see padding as being something someone's going to complain about eventually, just because otherwise you have to manually trim off the padding from the URL yourself before you query any of these APIs.
Yeah, and while that's easy enough for people to do, it's also easy enough for us to write trim end as the first thing inside of all of our methods.
Existing implementations mostly not adding padding, but ignore it for decode, but do not add it on encoding. So my plan was just do same. But
that makes total sense. Yeah.
Levi had proposed that variation in parameter names, and we got distracted on the out, I think.
That's a mouthful. But yeah.
So do people like it better as a suffix or a prefix? Or
we could do an infix right before text.
Or on the method.
I don't like it on the method because it's asking if it's valid UTF-8.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think I like UTF-8 first of the two, I suppose. I mean, we could just go wild and call it ASCII, even though no, I'm just kidding.
I mean, these all should have been called ASCII in the first place, but whatever.
Right. I mean, we already have the pattern from Base64, right? So I guess like we're trying to stay somewhat consistent, but we've already changed quite a few things. So I mean,
we could say ASCII everywhere here and be very clear that we don't actually support UTF-8.
It would, I think that would confuse people ultimately. Like,
okay,
we started down something previously, and while it's technically incorrect, like people are used to it. Just keep doing it.
okay.
I mean, yeah, and it's kind of correct, so it's fine.
Well, except for that we don't support UTF-8 white space.
Well,
right. So it's
we
if
don't
we
necessarily need to support white space at all, though.
Right. So it's if we
That's
support white
easy.
space, do we support non-7-bit ASCII white space?
No.
I see.
No. Don't.
I don't think we do that even for Base64, so please
right.
no.
Well, again, that would mean that we don't actually support UTF-8, that we only support ASCII. And,
Right. Yeah.
And so that would be, do we admit that and say that this is encode to ASCII, and somebody needs to know that ASCII is compatible with UTF-8 because we mean ASCII 7 and not ASCII 8. But
we've had this conversation in previous UTF-8 APIs, and I think the consensus was just call it UTF-8. Like it's what people are looking for, and we don't need them to understand all of these different concepts. Ultimately, it doesn't really hurt anyone. The only people who get confused are people who have a deep understanding of the space. But, that's what documentation's for.
yeah, chat points out UTF-8 span formatable. It was a prefix, so let's go with a prefix here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an adjective since we always like talking about like parts of speech, at least in this case.
All right.
Cool.
Are you still happy with it, Christoph? I think it has all the
Yes.
things you cared about.
Well, I'm waiting for the assembly factoring. Where is it gonna ship?
Do you need it net standard?
Yes.
Does system buffers ship net standard right now?
Pretty sure it did.
System buffers text Base64 lives in system memory. I don't know if that's a frozen package or not.
Yeah, it might be because I think that's where span ships, right?
Yes.
Yeah, then I think that one is.
Well, we wouldn't change span, but can we bump it to add a new type?
No, because then you can't replace the inbox assembly at that point, right?
Ah. Well, it just means that the net core app implementation just needs to say it's a type forward. We should be able to add new types.
I think we had this conversation. I need to look into it again. I think the conclusion we had last time was that is true if you can rely on the assets being given to the app are correct. But the problem is when you do a roll forward, that might not be the case.
But presumably we already have a system.memory targeting something in the netcore family that says it's a type forward. So roll forward shouldn't break that.
No, imagine you're building for net 6.
Yeah.
And then the app is roll forward for net 7. The net 7 version now has a higher version than the output you got for net 6.
Right,
but in the output of net 6 you had additional types.
But it says if you wanted system.span, that now is type forwarded to system private core lib, and it'll load the new system.memory. or system.memory.dll and type forward back to span.
Except for if system.span in net7 got additional APIs added to it. Because it's in box, the ref assembly will no longer match with what's on 6. Users will try and use an API from 7, thinking it will roll forward and work, and it won't.
No, because
so there's this whole complexity there.
The ref wouldn't say. The ref, I think, would still be frozen for span. It would still look like span.
You're talking about additional types, but the problem is the replacement happens at the assembly level, right? So when you're building for net6, you get a binary that the app deploys that is a higher version of what shipped so a higher version of system.memory.dll.
Right.
That what ships in net6 that has the additional types. And now you roll the app forward from net6 to net7. The net7 version of system memory that ships in box is a higher version of what the app had deployed. That doesn't have those types. And now you get a type load exception because the types no longer exist. So basically, the model you're describing only works if there's no roll forward ever. As soon as you have roll forward, the problem is, well, there is no version that can give the app that would always have all the types. Does that make sense?
I think it would have worked if we hadn't said that the ref already type forwards. But the ref we encoded the type forwards into.
Yes, I think the problem. So the model only works if the assembly doesn't contain any type forwards. I think, as soon as the assembly contains type forwards to platform types, the assembly is basically frozen.
I think it works if the impl contains type forwards, but we made the ref contain type forwards, which means it will light up new APIs and confuse things.
I don't think it matters because this is all build time, right? So like ref only matches for build time, and build time is usually fine. The problem is when you change the thing underneath it. That's where the complexity comes in, because then you basically have to have a path forward for everything.
Right, but you would just get a newer system.memory that says, oh, by the way, span lives over in system private core lib, and it'll go, okay. And then everything that would have been from the ref would still be there, even if we've added more to it. So,
right, but that works what you said. You can just give people a new version of system.memory.dll. Yeah. It would still have to type forward for the things that were type forwarded on that platform, but it could have additional types that live wherever it wants to live, including itself, right?
Right, but since we put the type forwards in the ref, I don't know if that confuses things. So we're back to Christoph's question, where does this guy live?
Yeah. So, I mean, basically what I'm hearing is we want to have this thing out of band. I think we just need a place for it. Is it just this one type then?
Yes.
You could make a system buffers text package, but there's already types in the system buffers text namespace that shipped in system memory.
But that's fine.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think my preference, because system buffers text Base64 is in system memory, is if we can figure out if it can work in system memory, we should put it there, and if there's a reason we really can't change it, then make a system buffers text package. But we're going to get the same problem of the impl for net core app is going to say forward this to wherever this lives in net core app. Because I assume this is going to be part of shared runtime.
Right, yeah, we're not going to require the package for .NET 9, I would hope.
And
man, how quickly are we going to burn assemblies though?
Yeah.
So as soon as you type forward, like the assemblies, like,
and honestly, if this only breaks applications when they do a major version roll forward, like our answer is try it, and if it works, you can do it, but we won't fix bugs that you encounter. And if you try it and it explodes, recompile. That's always been our answer for apps.
Yeah. I mean, it is, but like, it's the problem is that, so it's one thing to say it's not supported. It's a different thing when, you know, people encounter these arbitrary load errors and it's absolutely unintuitive of what is the root cause for this, right? So like diagnosing those issues is virtually impossible, right? I mean, we can decide that we don't support the scenario at all anymore, but that's not where we are. We do support roll forward. We just don't make it the default.
Oh, yeah, I thought our support story is we won't fix bugs that you encounter in roll forward. if they're fixed with recompiling, and we tell you that you should test it before you deploy it, and if it doesn't work, don't deploy it. That we always encourage recompiling, but roll forward should kind of generally work. Asterisk.
So I think the support policy we have is like, it will work except for breaking changes. Now you can decide that those OOP things are breaking changes, but that's, they're not really breaking changes as much as they're just by design, right? Like the API exists on both places. It's just that the way the API ships is, fundamentally not compatible with roll forward. It's a bit weird. So, but I mean, like we can decide to put it somewhere. Like I think we can find a home for it. I mean, but to Stefan's point, I mean, yes, that is the problem with shipping things out of band, is that you need to fundamentally find a home for those types. And unfortunately, in many cases, the answer is it needs to be a new assembly because of the way the runtime works. Which is why we generally don't want to polyfill everything.
But given that this is only static, we wouldn't care if it doesn't unify with the one in the framework.
That is true.
I mean, that's true until you want to patch it, right?
No, I mean, like, if you had the net 8 impl that said, oh, this lives really in this assembly, because it can't type forward to system private core lib, okay, great, we have 2 copies of it. Pull the updated version
Well, that's what I
from
mean.
NuGet.
Like, I mean,
we would have patched it.
Right. I meant like via like in-place update, right?
Right.
So I mean, from a security standpoint, you can say, yeah, we only patch, the version where it's in.
You doing an app
Everything
roll
else you do it
forward.
yourself.
Yeah, you doing an application roll forward with an out-of-date NuGet package means you could regress a security bug, but you should have upgraded your NuGet package. You would have had the same thing if you were running on the TFM you built for. So.
Yeah, more practically, I would be more concerned about behavior mismatches, where part of the stack runs on the inbox version, the other part runs on this one, right? You could imagine asymmetric dependency on it. We fix we add a feature, we fix a bug, and then all these two sides no longer agree on what they see.
Yep.
Yeah. ASP.NET thinks you're going to trim the white space, but it turns out we're running a static version from an old package on roll forward.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of, again, it goes back to like, this is not fun to diagnose when you play games like that.
Yep.
So, yeah, okay, we need an out-of-band version for this. I mean, it's, we already have a bunch of packages. We can maybe put in one of the existing ones as well.
Right. Again, so, yeah, I think, so I wrote down system memory is the most obvious, but we'll figure it out.
Right, this is all just, well, I mean, this particular type, right, all it does is just bit fiddling, right? It doesn't really have any dependencies on inbox shit, right? So,
right.
You should be able to put it almost anywhere.
I think its implementation is entirely self-consistent, yeah.
Notably, system memory is one of the packages that we stopped shipping 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think partially because of what we said.
Right, so it's if it's frozen, then
4.55.
Then we need to go somewhere else. Unless we feel we can thaw it. Did we freeze it because we weren't changing it? Or did we freeze it because, oh my god. And
so one thing that's not entirely clear to me is if we include this in the shared runtime, it like type forwards to core lib, we add a new system text buffer package with just this class. Like, is that frozen too, like immediately? Like as soon as we release it?
So the general rule that we have is, so we have a bunch of packages that we ship that are also inbox. And generally speaking, if the entire assembly can be safely replaced with the version that the app carries, it's fine. It's basically the idea that, take, for example, system collections immutable or system reflection metadata, right? They both ship in box, but the app can carry a newer version, and then we load the newer version.
So we made breaking changes to the system memory. Is that like kind of why it's frozen, or like?
Well, the problem is you can't safely replace the inbox version with the one that the app carries, because as soon as type forwards are involved, there's only so many, things you can slice the versioning basically, and at some point it's just you can't have it both ways basically. As soon as you as soon as there's a type forwarded, there are cases where when you replace the inbox version, you basically get the wrong types.
But like that's still the case here. I guess that's the point you're making about it being static. But like we would be type forwarding this to core lib, right? Like.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So yes, so if we decide the inbox, so yeah, that's the part I didn't quite say. If we decide that the implementation lives in core lib, and then we just ship this as an OOB, then basically the implication is as soon as we do that, yeah, the API is frozen. You cannot add.
Yeah, that's the part that's really annoying. So we have this like one type forever, one type frozen package, and that's like our pattern for doing something that needs to be available in like net standard and in the new version of .NET. Like,
well, it's only required for things where you need it in an assembly that already exists, basically, yeah. And that assembly can't be replaced.
Yeah, I mean, this one, I don't think it needs to technically live in system private core lib. It could be its own assembly that happens to be distributed on NuGet and lives in the shared runtime. But
so
I know a bunch of the Microsoft.bcl packages.
Stuff?
Where
does all the web encoder stuff live? Isn't that already?
Stu, System Text Encoding's web.
Is it extensions?
So,
yeah.
Why is Base64 in core lib? I assume like something in core lib uses it versus like type.
I think the only reason why it's there is because that's where Base64 was, and that's only because we put it there. I don't think it even had to be there. And I think web encoders is just an extensions because again that's where we put it. So in that sense we could decide that this doesn't live in system.blah. We could just say it's Microsoft extensions.blah, and then put it there as well, I guess.
Why
we
is
should
it
definitely
not?
put it next to Base64. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
There's a package, system binary Base64. What is this package?
That might be dead. Let me check.
Yeah, it says that it's deprecated, but it was added in .NET 9.
I think it's just saying it's compatible with .NET 9 by virtue of being compatible with Net Standard 1.0.
System binary Base64.
Yeah, it shipped for Net Standard 1.1, so it's compatible with everything.
It has one type Base64, and this one would be a nice peer. Like, why is it even deprecated?
I think it never shipped stable.
It never shipped.
Yeah.
Oh, it never shipped.
Yeah. I think the only version it has was a pre-release, and then we folded it into a different assembly later. Probably moved it to system because it's probably we renamed it to system.buffers.txt.
Yeah, that would I guess.
I mean, is it an option to add the API to MS Core Lib and then also forward? I mean, also do this package?
That's
like
the one
any
that
package
freezes the package immediately, though. That's why we wouldn't want to type forward. It might be better, like, if we're going to create a new assembly, we might as well just, like, include it in the shared framework instead of type forward. Like.
Well, but that goes back to my earlier point, right? It's like we generally don't want to do that either, right? So like I think we're generally fine with saying if you're running OOP, you get an additional assembly, right? But we don't want to increase the number of inbox assemblies until we have to, right? Because assemblies are not free. They do cost us quite a bit, actually.
Assuming that ASP.NET also wants to say API, it will at least be in their shared runtime, at which point it may as well be in the common shared runtime because it's just buffer management. At which point the package only exists for Christoph. At which point we make decisions.
Yeah,
and honestly, my opinion is we don't care about roll forward. Like I believe that's our general opinion, is we don't care. If it breaks your app, it breaks your app.
I don't think that's true. We do care. It's just that it's degrees, right? I think, but to the earlier point, I think so it doesn't have to live in core lib. We could, but I think we want the inbox version to be an existing assembly. It seems dumb to me to have a net new assembly just to house Base64 URL encoding. Like that seems dumb. So we would have to we have to find an existing assembly somewhere. It doesn't have to be called. It could be anywhere else. And then if we're lucky, we can maybe pick an assembly where it would be safe to replace it, right? And I think anything that is in extensions, for example, is kind of in that category already.
But you're
that would
asking
be...
to freeze a new package, right? Because the NuGet package.
No. Like I'm saying, if you pick an existing...
I don't think this should go in extensions.
If you pick an existing assembly/package, if that package can be safely replaced, then no, the API surface is available as is, right? So all the extensions are in that category. You can install a newer version than what's in the framework, and that's generally workable, right?
Yeah, this doesn't feel like it belongs in Microsoft extensions at all.
Yeah, well, that's a different conversation. All I'm saying is that we should pick an existing assembly.
Sure.
We should not create a net new assembly for the inbox identity. And then if we find one that we can replace, well, then the OOP assembly identity could be the same. And then, the API isn't frozen. If we can't find one we can replace, then, well, that's the same deal as putting it in call it, right? At that point, you're just like, well, there's an OOP assembly identity, it's frozen, and then that's the end of that.
Fair enough. But, so, exercise to be worked out offline.
I'm not saying it belongs in extensions, but we should find a place.
Yeah. So.
Right. You need a net standard 2, right? That's still the same deal, right?
Can anyone think of such an assembly? So it has to not be frozen due to existing type words. We want it to already be...
System text JSON is that state. None of its types, like its implementation, doesn't type forward outside of its assembly. It is an assembly. It can be replaced whole hog, and everything just works. So it's things that are half in, half out are fine. Emo saying it's only a problem once it's type forwarded.
Yeah. No, I understand that part now. So system text JSON is an example. Like if that's the only example that we could think of, I'm sure there's more. But that doesn't seem like
system formats ASN1, system formats CBOR. Yeah. These are all going to be actually CBOR might not be inbox, but system formats ASN1 is inbox and NuGet, and the NuGet one can replace it, and there's no problem.
Would we be okay with system text JSON?
Yeah, I don't think it belongs there.
Okay, well, but if the goal is to reuse the package that's in the appropriate state, is there anything better?
But why would we say, oh, you want Base64 URL? Go reference system text JSON. Like,
we don't want to manage one class. Yeah, no, that's fair. But it's just because we don't want to be creating a bunch of NuGet packages.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to make a bunch of NuGet packages, right? If we're talking about a bunch of static helper APIs, like we could take the basic system buffers text Base64 or whatever it is. Right now that's in system memory, but even the one in system memory has kind of gotten out of sync with what's checked into .NET 9. So you can imagine, like, we rip that type out of that package and move the entirety of the system buffers text namespace into its own package, including the old Base64 type. And that way that whole thing can just live oob. And people can use it even if they're targeting. People can use the new Net9 APIs on the Net9 types even if they're targeting down level. Like, you could make that all work somehow.
Yeah. So I think that the answer for the package is it's going to need to be worked out offline. The only question that I think really is left for the people in this room is how much do we care to go make Base64 look like what we just made Base64 URL look like? And if the answer is it's in a frozen package, it's hard to touch, let's just leave it alone, then sure. Or we can say we can add it to get it up to parity with what this looks like, and if we've renamed the methods, we get to do some fun, hide this from IntelliSense, and suggest people use the new names. We can say that's going to be a long discussion, and we should make a new issue for it. I just want to know how much we think we care.
Yep, that sounds right to me.
All right. So with crickets, it's up to somebody who wants to use the existing Base64 class to be upset that it doesn't look like this to open the issue. First complaint decides when it goes in the queue.
Well, I think we already know who complains, right? Like, so might as well take a look.
Oh, so you think we should make them look closer to each other?
Oh, sorry, you're talking about something completely different. Never mind. No, yes, I fine with leaving them as is.
Right, it's the existing Base64 skipped the characters things because that was already on convert. We did the operation status. We also made the int returning, the array returning. Like, do we want to square the circles on system buffers text Base64 or wait until somebody complains?
Yeah, I think we can wait.
Okay. Okay.
So it's gonna go to the package that you were just showing? Sorry, what is the conclusion of packaging?
So the answer for package is we're not deciding it in this meeting. It's somebody needs to go do some work and figure out where we can put it, and we won't be able to come up with an answer here. So.
But we understand net standard is a requirement. Is it net standard 2.0 or 2.1?
Yeah, 2.0.
Nothing needs 2.1. Once you need 2.1, you're saying you're net 5+, at which point just net core only, and we don't ship it backwards. So net standard 2.0 is the target. All right, we've gone massively over. Thanks for joining us, Kevin, but your issue was the first one that didn't make it. And for everyone who watched online, especially for our 20 minutes of not coming to a conclusion on where this thing's going to live, thanks for being with us. We had some good feedback, and we will see you all next Tuesday at our same .NET time here on our same .NET channel. Auf Wiedersehen.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.